In this video, I'm going to walk you through creating some useful user-defined functions through VBA. This will allow you to access them through the formula bar within Excel, and so you can create all those functions that you've thought Excel's always been missing. So the first thing to note is that when you're in a spreadsheet, when you hit the equal sign and start typing, it'll start suggesting functions. Well, these functions can pull from your VBA module. So if I go into developer and go to Visual Basic, you'll see here that I have a bunch of procedures here. Well, these are subs. Subs are not going to appear in the formula bar when I click equal, but functions will. And so first thing I'm going to do is create a new module. I'm going to call it my function module. And this is where I'm going to put in my functions. So just a proof of concept, when I do function test function, now when I go over to my spreadsheet here, I can type in test function and it'll show up there. And so the formulas that show up here, the functions, they're going to pull from your VBA module. They could pull from two different locations. So they could pull from the actual workbook that you're in, or they could pull from a workbook that is open. And for my example, I'm going to put it in my tools.xlam, which I created in a previous video, which I'll link down below. And so I'm going to put it in there. So these functions will be available every single time I open Excel. If I put them in just the workbook, add a module in just this workbook, they'll only be available when I have this workbook open. And with the tools add-in, they'll be available anytime you have Excel open. So now I'm going to remove that one. And so I'm going to create my first function that's useful. So if you're a developer, and if you've ever dealt with PHP, you know that PHP has a cool function called UCFirst, which means uppercase first, which essentially capitalizes the first letter and it lowercases everything else. Well, Excel doesn't have that function, so we can write it. So I'm going to say function UCFirst, and I'm going to say by val, it's going to take an input of an input string, and I'm going to give it an optional of to do the whole word or just do one word or all words in that string. So I'm going to say all words, it's Boolean, and I'm going to default it to false. So it'll only do the first word by default, but you could set the default to be true. So it'll do every word individually. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to declare the result. So I'm going to return something. I'm going to go ahead and go to the bottom and put the actual return, just so now I have a string and I'm returning it. So now is where here is where I'm going to actually calculate and change it. So first I'm just going to check if we're going to do all the words and set up my end if. And so this is an if block. And so if it's not all words, which meaning I'm only doing the first word, then it's fairly simple. I'm going to say s result equals ucase. So I'm going to uppercase the left input string, the first letter, and I'm going to lowercase the remaining part, which to do the remaining is just input string. And I'm just going to start at 2. And mid also has another parameter where you could say length, but if you just want the remainder of it, you leave that blank, and then you can close that. And so now I'm putting the value of the uppercase first letter and lowercase the rest of the word in that S result. And then down here is where S result gets returned to the spreadsheet. Now, it's going to be a little more complicated if I have multiple words. So I'm going to set up an array. So putting those parentheses when I declare the variable tells VBA that this is an array. It's not just one string, it's a multiple strings. And then I'm going to set up I because I'm going to cycle through the words. I is going to be the index of each word. So the first thing I got to do is split my input value, and I'm going to split it based on spaces because that's how you indicate words. So and I'm going to go ahead and put everything as lowercase. And you'll see that VBA will fix the case sensitivity on some of the default. functions. So I'm going to lowercase it all and split it by a space. So now what that's going to do is create an array of all the words in that particular input string, which the input string is what I'm going to put in the formula in the actual spreadsheet. And now, so I'm going to just go through all of the different indexes, which means I'm going to go through all of the words, and I'm going to start at the lower bound of words. So if it starts at 0, it's going to start at 0. If it has 1, it's always best to just use L bound and U bound, just because then you'll be sure you're on the upper bound and lower bound and you won't get an error. So I'm going to say, and if the length, make sure the word actually has some characters to it, because I don't want to try to do like functions on a blank word. Let's say end if, and then words I. So I'm going to essentially change the value of it to U case. I'm going to uppercase the first one, and then just the first letter. And just like I did above, I'm going to do the mid formula on the rest. And that should be it. In fact, I'll make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. So that's just going to cycle through all the words, and it's going to uppercase the first letter, lowercase the last one. Now I'm going to actually combine all of that. So I've essentially changed all the words in that array. Now I just need to combine it. And there's a function within VBA that does this. It's called join. And then that's the array. And I'm going to join it, by a space. So now all my words that I've changed the capitalization of, I'm joining them back together, putting the space back in there. So now I'm going to go back, drag it over here just to show you how it works. So now I can do UCFirst. So it's available. Now, unfortunately, with Excel and VBA, it does not give you any descriptions. There's no way to put a description within and then add in. So you just have to remember what your parameters were. So for this, I'm going to say UCFirst, and I'm just going to put it like that. And you'll see it, since I didn't say all words, it left the second one as lowercase, but I can change this to true. And now you'll see that it's able to uppercase the first letter, lowercase everything else of each word within that string. So that's a quick way to essentially copy what the PHP function could do, and even add that extra function, that extra parameter to even do a little bit more, because that's the benefit of VBA. You can make these functions do exactly what you want them to. So the next useful function that I'm going to write here is going to be function random selection. And this one is going to take by val a values range as range, because I'm going to have the user select a range and then essentially pull a random value from that range. This could help you if you're trying to pick a winner in a contest or pick a specific thing or just generate a sample. This function will allow you to pick a random one from a group, from a range. And so the first thing, I'm going to get the total amount of rows in there. So I'm going to say L total for long, just in case it goes really big. So my L total is values range dot count. So that's going to give me the total amount of cells that I'm going to be selecting from. And now next I'm going to now I'm going to create my index. So that's what I'm going to pick. So the index is within that range, what I'm going to pick. So I'm going to set that. And now I'm actually going to randomize. This is a function within Excel or within VBA. It's randomized, which essentially scrambles the data. So you should always randomize before you select a random number, just because it makes sure it's truly random. And now my index is going to be integer RND, which actually gets me, RND gets me a number between 0 and 1. It's a decimal number like 0.3, 0.5, all the way from 0 to 1. And so now that's not going to work for me. I'm going to actually need to get in, I'm going to translate that point decimal number into a range index. So to do that, I'm going to multiply it by the total, and then I'm going to add 1, just because this int function right now is going to convert it to an integer. And so if it turns out to be 3.4, that's going to turn into 3. And so technically it could show up as 0.2. So if I did integer, there would be index would be 0. And so that would throw an error. So I add 1 to it. So it always starts at 1 and you'll get the correct number. So I've got my index. That's going to be a random index within that range. So now I'm going to return it. Random selection. And to return values, you always do the function name in equals. So that's how it knows to return the value to the cell in Excel. So I'm going to say, I'm going to return it as values range dot cells. And I'm going to put the index in there. So, dot value. So that's going to give me an index. It's going to pull the value from that particular index. And so if it's 5 columns and 18 rows, you're going to have, around 100, and it's going to give you probably like 98. 98 is going to be, and it starts in the top left and does columns first. So if it's A through E, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so it's going to pull that index, and so it's going to be random. But for this example, just to show you how it works, if I do random selection, I select that, and now it's going to randomly select. And then the one thing to note about this is random, and Excel updates your formulas every time something is changed. So if I just even act like I'm changing, it's going to change this every single time. So just to note, if you want to keep your random selection, go and use that paste as values shortcut that we have from the previous one, because as soon as you try to do any edits on the sheet, it's going to re-randomize, re-pull a new value. The next little useful tool that I'm going to write is going to be function GetFirstName. So if you've ever gotten Excel spreadsheets and like first and last name are in the same column, you can write yourself a formula that's actually going to extract that first name for you. And I'll show you how to do that. So I'm going to call it GetFirstName. And now I'm going to just set, do the same thing as result equal as string. And at the very bottom, GetFirstName equals as result. So now here's where I'm actually going to extract. So I'm going to be taking that input string in, and I'm going to say, first thing I'm going to do is check to see if there's a space there. Because if you have a name that, like over here, you see that it's comma space. If you have first name and last name, you're going to have a space in there. And so we need to make sure you have a space, because if you don't have a space, you pretty much, there's not really much you can do. And this function is more based on if you have, are you getting a first and last name in the same column. So I'm going to check to see if it has a space. That's the inString function, input string. And if it has a space and the index is greater than 0, because if it doesn't have it, the index is 0 because it's not in the string. But if it shows up in the 4th character, it'll be 4. And I'm going to say end if. And if it doesn't have anything, I'm just going to return it back to the initial string. So if it doesn't have a space, I'm just going to return whatever the input string was. And so next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to split it by that space. So I'm going to say split input string. And I could do the same thing up here where I do it as a array and stuff like that. But since VBA is not necessarily need to be typed, I don't really necessarily need to do that. and I'm going to get an starting index because there's two different ways that a last name, first name can happen. You could have first name space last name, or you could have comma or last name comma space first name. And so I'm going to adjust for that. And rather than having two different, I could have two different functions that check for that, but I'm going to put them all in the same function by checking the index. And you'll see here in a second how that works out. And I'm going to pull the upper bound SBL name. So that's going to get me the starting index and the end index. And so I'm going to say if in string input string looks like comma space greater than 0, that way I know it's last name first. And then if it's other way around, then it's going to be first name space last name. But I know I need to change my starting index because the first name is going to be the second index. So I'm going to say I start equals I start plus 1 just to increment it 1. And then, but if it's the last name or if the first name is first, I want to make sure the end is the last. So I'm going to say I end minus, whoops, minus 1. And this, I change the increments here for in case that there's somebody with a space in their name, like a Mary Ann, Katie Ann, or something like that. So you need to adjust for that just in case there's two spaces in there. So that's how this works. That'll actually adjust for those spaces. Now I'm actually going to cycle through, same as I did up here for the words for the UCFirst. I'm going to cycle through what I have. I equals I start to I end. I'm going to go ahead and put the next in there. And I'm going to say S result equals S result because I'm just going to concatenate it all back together. Any other words? SPL name. So what that is doing, and I'm cycling it just for those Mary Anns. If I didn't think there was people with like multiple first names in there, I wouldn't necessarily have to do it. I could just come straight and take trim of this whatever index that I decided was going to have the first name, but this will adjust for people with two names that are separated by a space. And now to test it to see how it works, I'm going to say get first name over here. So it passes that through. Put it down. As you can see, I get all the first names there. And if I change this around, notice that did not change. But say if I left it the same, but forgot the comma there, it now thinks that the first name is the first one because without the comma, it kind of looks like first name, last name. So that's how do you get, that's a quick formula to get the first name out of that. Now let's move on to get the last name. It's going to be very similar. So in fact, I'm going to just go ahead and copy that down and just adjust things. So I'm going to say get last name. I'm going to go ahead and put this down here. And the only thing that's going to really be different here is going to be this section. And so I'm going to split it. So I'm going to leave that. I'm not necessarily going to have to do this special thing of because there's not many last names that have spaces. Most of them have hyphens, but you might have like a van name or or like a DuPont or something like that that might have two spaces or space and stuff. But for this example, I'm not going to worry about ones with spaces there. And I'm just going to say, whoops, I'm just going to get rid of the index stuff. And I'm just going to go straight to getting the values here. So if it has the comma in there, which means the last name is first. Well, since I'm splitting based on space, it's actually going to include that comma in the very, very first index of the split name. So I need to remove that. So and that's just as simple as taking the left of the split name with all the characters except for the very last one, which is going to be name 0. I'm going to get the length of it -1 and close my parentheses there. And then now if it doesn't have the comma, which just means first name space last name, I'm going to go s result equals trim SPL name u bound, and I'm going to say SPL name and then 3 close parentheses, and I can remove that. So now I'm going to come over here, I'm going to run it. So get last name. Now it knows. I'm going to drag it all the way down. Gets all my last names there for you. So now this is all going to depend on your data set. So you write your function to mirror what your data set is. So if your data set is only going to be last name, first name, then you can actually even omit some of this stuff. But if you might have both, then you probably need to add some if statements in there to adjust for that. So the next useful function that I'm going to add to my tools here is going to be called GetAge. So I'm going to say function GetAge, and this could be used to get years of anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be an age. It could be like years of service or just years from any different kind of value. So, but typically it's for age. So, or if you have a higher date or something in there, you can get all different things, but it's to get the years between two different numbers. So the first thing I'm going to do is check to make sure the user entered a date. So because VBA has this nice isDate function, might as well use it. And to make sure I've got a date, and if it is, I'm going to just say get age equals an invalid date, because rather than give an error, I'm just going to say, actually write in the words invalid date. So I'm going to say exit function. So it's going to essentially error out if they don't put in a date. And now I'm going to actually convert what they put to a date, since I know, so if it got this far, I know it actually is a date. And let's see, I'm going to add some spaces just so I can see up higher. And so I'm going to say equals C date, which means cast as a date. And so I'm going to say cast as a date. So now I have that their date as a actual date type, which allows me to do a few more things. And I'm going to pull today's date, because if I'm getting years as of today, I need that. Equals date, and date is a built-in function of VBA to get the actual current date. And I'm just going to say GetAge equals date diff, which date diff is a built-in function. And as soon as I hit open parentheses, it'll actually tell me what those are. I'm going to just say Y. So I'm going to get the years, because if you put DDDD or something, it'll get you the days, and you can get all the different, it's just a date difference of two dates. And so you can get whichever number you're looking for. And so I'm going to say D today. So I'm going to find the years difference between my input date and today. And if you did it the opposite way, it would just show up as a negative number. And so that's going to get me my years. Well, what if the date has already passed, or if it hasn't passed this year? So this is where I'm just going to say, this is going to be a little bit more of a complicated, but if the month of D input is greater than the month of D today, or month of D input equals the month. So if it's less than, or if it's greater than this month, I know just straight up that it's or it hasn't occurred yet. But if the months are equal, then I actually got to compare the days. So month D input equals, month D today. So if the months are actually equal, then I need to make sure the days are different. Then, day today. Oh, forgot my parentheses here. I'm gonna go ahead and close my if block. And then if that's the case, I know I have to actually remove a year if it hasn't occurred yet. So now, and I can show you here as an example, if I want to get their age, now I can quickly get all their ages. And so that'll give me the actual years of what their ages are as of today. The next custom function that I'm going to do is for the statistics people out there. And it's kind of strange that Excel hasn't added this one, but it's weighted average. Because they have all the different averages out there in all the formulas, but they don't have a weighted average, which is a fairly common statistical formula. But so we can add the ones that Excel didn't give us. As range, and then by val, weights. So I get the values in one range, weights in another. Okay, and so the first thing I'm going to do is actually make sure that the same rows match. So I want to make sure the values range, value range, dot rows, dot count, weights range, rows, dot count, they actually match. Because if they don't match, I mean, you're going to have weights that are different. I mean, you might not correspond to different values. So you actually have to have the matching amount. So then the next thing I'm going to do is actually get the total weights. So I'm going to essentially add all of these together just because I need to get the total weights so each number gets a percentage. And so to do that, I'm going to use the worksheet function to sum. I could loop through those and sum them all, but it's easiest just to use the application.worksheet function.sum, which essentially any function that's in the worksheet you can access via this. And so I pass in a range and it'll sum that for me. So in the next part, I'm actually going to go through those values. So I'm going to go through them one at a time. I'm going to essentially take the number, take this divided by my total weights, and get the sum product of it. And so I'm going to create my average, which is what I'm going to return. So I'm actually going to come down here and say weighted average equals the average. So I'm going to return that. So that's what I'm going to put all the average in. The item weight is actually going to be the sum product of that. And so I'm going to go through them one at a time. I'm going to go through each row on the value in the values range. I'm going to get the value. I'm going to get the weight because essentially I'm going to go through each one individually. So, and I use the cells index just because I'm going to use the first, if I'm using row one of the values, I need row one of the weights. And then I'm going to take the percentage. Weight is the percentage is going to be my weight divided by the total. And then I'm going to multiply those together. And then I'm going to add it to my average. And so it's just going to be a running average. It's going to get all of them together, and then it's going to return it. So I can show you that here. I'm going to call it weighted average. And then I'm going to put my first, so that's the values range. I'm going to select that. Then here I'm going to select my sales reps, which is going to be so how many sales reps I have in each region to get the weighted average. Hit enter. And then I'm just going to put and so then I have my weighted average. So that's my weighted average of sales if you put in how many like sales reps they had in that region. And just to show you the difference of that, if I just used their regular average formula and did that, you'll see that the average is different, but the weighted average is going to be a different number than the actual average. So those are some functions that you can add to your workbooks, and those are really common functions that you'll probably need on a regular basis. And you can write more and you can adjust them to your needs. And you can have what I do recommend is actually using a lowercase something in the actual name just to distinguish it from the actual Excel formulas here, because their formulas are actually going to be all in caps. But so if you have some lowercase in there, you'll know that this one's yours as opposed to that. And so These functions are good and they're useful for all sorts of different things, but you could write functions that are just specific to workbooks as well, and they will still show up here. So it's a very valuable tool when you're creating your tools. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please subscribe, and I'll keep posting videos showing how the different things that VBA can do for you. Thank you for watching.